It started out like any other day, but ended up becoming my worst nightmare. But let's start at the beginning. It all began on a normal Saturday when I decided to take a stroll around the shopping center to buy a couple of things. When I arrived, I found a crowded place. Families shopping, children running around, and the noise of people filling the air. I decided to go into a technology store because I was looking for a new phone. I was very pleased when I entered. The store was full of bright lights, it was very well organized, and there were lots of devices on display in the windows. Also, the background music was great. After looking at several phone models, I found one that seemed perfect. But as I headed to the checkout, I noticed something strange. I felt like someone was watching me, and although I couldn't see the person clearly, I noticed that they were a few steps behind me. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, so I continued with my purchase. But every time I stopped, the figure also stopped. They stayed far enough away not to be obvious, but close enough to make me feel uncomfortable. It was a strange situation. The person wasn't trying to hide, as if they wanted me to notice their presence, but they didn't show themselves. So, with a knot in my stomach, I decided it would be best to leave the shop and change location. On leaving there, I went into a clothes shop that was full of people, trying to lose my follower in the crowd. I started to look at some t-shirts, and when I looked at myself in the mirror, there he was again, the figure appearing behind me. I ran out of the shop, trying to blend in with the crowd, but I had no luck. The figure was still there, following me. I didn't know who he was. I couldn't see him properly because he was always hiding or blending in with the crowd. I only knew that he was wearing dark clothes and that he was a man, because I could see that in an instant when I saw him hiding behind a pillar. At that point, anxiety began to take hold of me. Who was this person and why was he stalking me? In a moment of desperation, I thought it would be best to seek help from security. But as I walked towards the security office, I realized that the stranger was keeping a constant distance behind me, as if he knew exactly how to act without arousing suspicion. It was unsettling. When I got to the office, I told one of the guards what was happening. He looked around, but there was no sign of the guy. "Are you sure he was following you? It's a shopping center, so maybe he was just going to the same place as you," he said with a half-skeptical smile. "No, I swear he was following me. It wasn't a coincidence," I said desperately, but the guard just shrugged. "Well, if I don't see him, there's nothing I can do. Maybe you should go home now," he suggested. And although his words were meant to reassure me, I couldn't help feeling that he didn't believe me. "All right, but if he shows up again, I'm going to come back," I finally told him. He nodded half skeptically, and I went off to continue my shopping, trying to convince myself that maybe the guard was right. However, the feeling of being watched remained very strong. I went into a sports shop further on, looking for a moment's distraction, but to my horror, there he was again, at the end of the trainer's section, this time staring at me. At that moment, panic overcame me. Now he wasn't hiding. He was a tall guy. He had a black sweatshirt with front pockets and a hood, and he had his hands in the pockets of his dark jeans. But the most chilling thing was that icy gaze that was completely fixed on me, following my every move. This guy was about 30 or 35 or so. I was 16 at the time, and when our eyes met, he gave a half smile that made my hair stand on end. I quickly looked away and moved towards the exit. I decided I needed a breather, so I went to the food court and found a table in the corner, trying to hide among the crowd. I ordered a coffee and tried to relax, watching people go by. "Relax, Ross," I muttered to myself, trying to control the trembling in my hands. "You're just thinking too much," I reproached myself. But what if he was a madman hell-bent on making me feel uncomfortable? I couldn't risk it being something more dangerous, so cautiously, I took out my phone, ready just in case I needed to take a photo of the stranger. But just when I felt ready to face the situation, I looked up and lost my cool. There was the guy right in front of me, his face covered by the dark hood that prevented me from distinguishing his features. I could feel the weight of his gaze upon me, and panic shot through my chest. What was I going to do now? The man said nothing. He just stood there staring at me intensely. My hands trembled as I tried to unlock my phone to take a photo of the mysterious guy, but something about his presence paralyzed me. It was as if my instinct told me not to provoke him. As I was deciding what to do, the silence became unbearable, and at one point our eyes met once more through his dark hood. A chill ran through my body, and suddenly he raised a finger to his lips in a gesture that clearly said, "Be quiet." The warning alone was terrifying, and my thoughts were filled with panic. I felt it was better not to challenge someone who seemed so unpredictable. So cautiously, I began to back away slowly, but without losing sight of him. He, on the other hand, did not move. He just kept getting a little closer each time. My mind began to desperately look for a way out, and I knew there was a security guard near the bathroom, so I headed that way. But the guy was following me very closely. Then I noticed that he was picking up the pace, and in an instant I realized that I wouldn't make it in time. So in a fit of desperation, I decided to run and started screaming for help. But that was the worst possible decision. The guy quickly closed the distance between us, and before I could do anything else, he threw me to the ground and got on top of me. In that moment, I felt his fingers squeezing my eyes with brutal force. I have no words to describe that pain. It was as if his fingers were going to pierce my skull, and no matter how hard I tried to defend myself, I couldn't stop it. This guy was incredibly strong and clearly had no intention of letting me go. But just when I thought it was all over, the security guard arrived and pushed the man back, taking him off me. However, that didn't stop the madman for long. A moment later, with an almost animal rage, the guy pushed the guard several meters, and because of the force with which he did it, his hood moved, revealing a face that almost made me scream in panic. The man's face was deformed and scarred. It was as if a truck had driven over his head, shattering it. His horrible appearance combined with that red, hate-filled gaze was enough to make anyone panic, and I was no exception. But I wasn't going to give in, so I got up with all my strength and ran down the aisle as if Satan were chasing me. "I told you not to make any noise," shouted the psychopath behind me as he chased me again. The crowd witnessing the scene tried to stop him, but it was like trying to stop a train. The guy was so full of rage that he was running over whoever got in his way. He was like a tiger after its prey, and unfortunately, the prey was me. As I ran as fast as my body would allow, the madman was right on my heels, and to make matters worse, I tripped and fell face first to the ground. In that moment, I thought it was all over. Now I was at the mercy of that monster. It was the end, or so I thought, because just before he could attack me again, something incredible happened. 6 people, like a battalion, threw themselves at him and knocked him to the ground, saving me from what I knew was certain death. I was in shock, hyperventilating, while the guy kept shouting and trying to free himself from the hands that held him face down on the floor. The guy punched, kicked, and screamed the whole time. He only stopped fighting when the police arrived minutes later. Even after all that time, he was still as furious as he had been at the beginning. Meanwhile, I was confused and scared, not understanding why this man, whom I didn't know at all, had taken such a vicious interest in me, and even more so, why he had gone from discreetly following me to becoming a wild beast, wanting to kill me. Days later, the police contacted me to clarify what had happened and to assure me that I was safe. They explained that the guy had escaped from a psychiatric hospital days before that encounter. Apparently, he had been hiding in the shopping center, concealed among the food aisles. What struck me most was knowing that he had chosen me at random, that is to say, it could have been anyone. I didn't know if he had always planned to attack me, but apparently he had developed an obsession with silence, and when I started running and screaming, he decided it was time to end my life. Since then, I have not set foot in that shopping center again, and every time I see a place crowded with people, I feel an irrational terror. It is terrifying to think that, among so many people, there could be someone else watching me with dark intentions. This happened to me when I was 12, so almost a decade ago. That day I went to the local shopping center with my dad and my younger sister. We were there to buy clothes because we were going on vacation, and to be honest, I hated it. She always ended up trying things on me that I didn't like, just because my mom said they looked good on me, when for me, basic jeans and black t-shirts were more than enough. All I wanted to do was stay at home and watch TV, but my mom never let me, so I had to go with them no matter what. Of course, that's what I, at 12 years old, thought, but now that I'm older, I understand that my mom cares about having family time more than the actual shopping. But back then, all I wanted to do was get out of there and do other things. As we walked and visited shops, I complained about everything, while my sister played this strange game to pass the time and not get bored. The game was simple. You made a circle with your index finger and thumb, kept it close to your waist, and if you managed to get the other person to look, wham, you hit them. It was easy to fool the other person because they didn't see it coming, but the more we played, the more complicated it became, and the blows became more challenging. After a while, I hit my sister harder than I should have, and of course, she started to cry. That led to my mom scolding me, telling me to grow up. At that moment, I jumped up in frustration, saying that I was always the one who ended up getting the worst of it. And like the rebellious child I was, I decided it was time to throw in the towel, and I went to sit on some benches outside the shop. But after about 10 minutes of extreme boredom, I started to need a bath. My mother used to tell me never to go to the toilet alone because you never know who's lurking around, so she almost always accompanied me. But on this occasion, I was angry with her, and besides, she herself had told me that I had to grow up because I was a big boy now, and big boys don't go to the toilet with mommy. So I decided to go alone. When I got to the toilets, I saw a guy coming out wearing a dark green jacket. When he walked past me, he stared at me, and that look gave me the creeps. His hair was unkempt and he smelled unpleasant, as if he hadn't bathed in days. In that place, sometimes you came across homeless people who came to wash themselves or use the bathroom, and of course, sometimes they had to be accompanied for safety reasons. I didn't know if that guy was really a homeless person who used to frequent the place, but he looked really bad. However, ignoring my instincts, I went into the bathroom, and as I sat on the toilet, I noticed a flash. At first, I didn't know what it was, but when I looked around, I saw a hand holding a camera from above the partition. At that moment, panic overcame me. Someone was trying to take my photo. It all happened quickly, and the only thing I could make out was the sleeve of a green jacket, the same one worn by the guy who had made me uncomfortable when I came out. I couldn't finish what I was doing before the door opened and a security guard surprised me. But instead of talking to the guard and telling him what had just happened, in a rush of adrenaline, I ran out of the bathroom, got to the shop, and told my dad what had happened. He didn't take it lightly. He ran straight to the bathrooms, furious. On the way there, the guard approached us and asked me why I had run out of the bathroom and if something was wrong. That's when we also told him what had happened, and he alerted the others on his radio. Then he disappeared down the corridor with my father. After a few minutes that seemed like an eternity, the guard and my dad finally came back, sweating and out of breath. They had searched the toilets, and of course there was no sign of the guy. Apparently he had escaped just in time. The police arrived shortly after. They asked me questions, and I had to give a description of the man. I was so confused that I wasn't even sure if it was the same one I had seen. A few days later, I got some good news. One of the guards who was there that day had recognized the man on the CCTV system. He had followed him to the bathroom and caught him trying to take a photo of another child. The pervert was arrested, and when they searched his house, they found a disturbing number of photos of various children, including me. I went to court for the trial, but they didn't call me as a witness. The guy later pleaded guilty to all charges. I don't know if he's been released from prison yet, but he now appears as a registered sex offender. Over time, I have realized that, in that situation, his intention was very clear. Since then, I have never felt safe in public places again. And well, my mom was right. You never know who is lurking. I always carried that lesson in my head, remembering that sometimes dangers come from unexpected places, even from those that seem harmless. Hi, my name is Shina, and this is the story of the scariest day of my life. A week before that horrible day, I went to the mall. At the time, I was a full-time nursing student and worked part-time in a restaurant, which meant I was on my feet most of the day, so as you can imagine, my feet were worn out because I only managed to rest for a couple of hours. That afternoon, I took a break from my exhausting schedule and decided to take a stroll around the shopping center, hoping to exchange my old sandals for some more comfortable shoes. When I arrived, I passed several shops displaying beautiful clothes, but I didn't have time to look, and in the end I ended up at Foot Locker. A middle-aged guy in a green shirt approached me with a smile. "Hi, we're having a buy one get one half price sale," he said cheerfully. I told him I was just looking for some comfortable shoes, regardless of the design, because the sneakers I was wearing were old and made me feel uncomfortable. While he was serving me, I realized that he was staring at me, as if he knew something that I didn't, and that insistent look began to make me uncomfortable, but I tried not to make too much of it. The guy told me that I probably needed an 8, but that a 7.5 might work, and that confused me, so I confirmed that I knew exactly what size I was looking for, but he told me that they didn't have my size in stock, which worried him. "I'm very sorry, but we can order them for next week," he said in a voice that sounded almost desperate. "That's okay, no problem," I replied, trying to be polite while thinking that I wouldn't be able to return that week. But anyway, I promised him that I would come back to pick them up the following week. I would see how. After that, I said goodbye, and as I left the store, I noticed that some employees were looking at me strangely, as if I were doing something inappropriate. I tried to ignore it and went on my way. I had a few minutes to spare, so I decided to take a stroll around JCPenney. But ever since I left that store, the feeling that I was being watched had settled in and wouldn't go away. This was a small mall, and by that time the place was almost empty. And when I turned around, there was always a body that seemed to quickly disappear around the corner. I told myself that I was imagining things and tried to enjoy my free time. However, that feeling of being watched persisted. It was a few weeks before I could return to the mall. I had too much work, but I finally managed to sneak away for 45 minutes and ran to Foot Locker, fearing that my shoes had already been sold. To my relief, I saw the same guy in the green t-shirt as I walked in. "Hi, Shina," he said, and that surprised me. How did he know my name? I hadn't told him. I assumed he'd probably seen my details on the credit card receipt, but even so, that seemed a bit weird. I smiled anyway and tried to relax. "Here are your Nikes," he said, winking and pulling a box out from under the counter. I felt nervous as I sat down, trying to ignore the uneasiness in the air. "Can I help you try them on?" he asked, and before I could reply, he got down on his knees and started to take off my sandals. I didn't know what to do. I stood there, paralyzed by discomfort, feeling his slender fingers brush against the skin of my feet. Just then, I heard a voice behind me. It was the manager shouting, "Hey, we told you you can't be here." I turned around immediately and saw several uniformed employees lined up behind me, and I saw that the manager's name tag said Kevin. While the guy in the green shirt was still holding my foot, the manager and the employees were looking at him reproachfully, and I could feel the atmosphere turning sour and becoming tense. Suddenly, everything happened very quickly. The manager shouted that he would call the police while I struggled with the awkwardness of the situation. It was then that I heard the typical sound of a camera shutter clicking, which made me quickly turn towards the guy who was still holding my foot, and to my horror, I saw that he had taken a photo of my feet while he was kneeling in front of me. What the hell is going on here, I asked myself. My mind couldn't process everything that was happening, but then the guy in the green shirt did something that left me speechless and completely disgusted. This man grabbed my foot, brought it close to his face, and before I could react, ran his wet tongue from my toes to my ankle. It was an instant of pure revulsion. Without thinking, I kicked him with all my might and knocked his glasses off his face. In the blink of an eye, that madman lunged towards the exit, and as he fled, he turned and said, "Delicious feet, Shina." He winked at me and walked out the door. I was paralyzed, sitting on the floor and feeling a mixture of disgust and indignation. A couple of the shop's employees came to console me, but their voices sounded like distant echoes. All I could think about was the disgusting slime he had left on my foot. I was completely horrified. When the police arrived, I had to explain that I had initially assumed he was a shop employee, as he wasn't wearing a uniform and seemed to know a lot about shoes. I was so confused and scared that I couldn't believe he was a predator. The officers, although understanding, made me feel even more uncomfortable as they told me that I was not the first woman to fall into that trap, as the guy had assaulted several female customers in that and other shoe stores. He was a sick man with a weird foot fetish, but for some reason knowing that I wasn't the only one didn't make me feel any better. On the contrary, I had a knot in my stomach made of anger and fear, so after giving my statement, I grabbed my things and quickly left the store. With the urgency of getting rid of that disgusting feeling, I looked for the nearest bathroom. I needed to wash my foot. I felt like I should scrub my skin raw. That part of the shopping center was empty, and most of the doors were already closed. So I ran to the nearest bathroom, and once inside, I splashed a good stream of soap on my leg, feeling tears start to well up in my eyes. How had I ended up here, in a lonely bathroom, cleaning the disgusting saliva off a stranger? I only came here for a new pair of trainers. What was all this about? My mind was in turmoil, full of thoughts like that, and while I was thinking about it, I heard a familiar voice. "Hello, Shina." My whole body tensed and I was completely paralyzed, feeling a chill running up my spine. I turned slowly and to my horror saw the guy in the green shirt leaning over the toilet, his camera clicking away. Terrified, I started screaming like crazy, trying to cover myself, but when I tried to move, he pushed me against the wall. My body crashed into the tiles and I fell to the floor as he crawled towards me. I was completely in shock, and in a quick movement, he took off my sandals, and with a sharp and sinister voice he said, "Just a little more of that flavor." I stood completely still, my heart pounding in my chest and my head aching, while his hands, which were monstrously strong, held my leg as he brought my feet closer to his mouth. My panic was such that, although in my head I tried to scream and run, my body was in a state of absolute paralysis. Suddenly, a calm, elderly voice rang out from outside the bathroom. "What's going on in there?" Then the man in the green shirt stopped and looked up. More animal than human, I would say. At that moment, the bathroom door opened and an elderly janitor entered. His face transformed into an expression of fear and confusion at the sight of the scene. At that moment, the creepy man, seeing his plan unravel, pushed the janitor out of the way and rushed out of the mall. Fortunately, the guy was caught a few hours later and later sentenced to 2 years in prison. From that day on, I developed a horrible phobia of buying shoes, so serious that to this day I only buy footwear from online stores. That experience was too terrifying and traumatic, but it taught me an important lesson. You should never blindly trust anyone or assume that everyone is there to help. Sometimes even those who appear friendly have dark intentions. Although I managed to get out alive, I was left with the feeling that the situation could have been much more serious than it was. Life is fragile, and you have to be always on your guard. You never know who is lurking.
Hi guys, I'm Syria, that's my name, like the country. I apologize in advance because I'm not the best storyteller in the world, but I'll do my best. Here goes. When I was a teenager, I lived in a small town in Pennsylvania. Although our town wasn't big, it had the basics. A gym, all those fast food restaurants, and a couple of clubs. The rest was small businesses and things people did on their own. I was 17 when the only shopping mall we had closed, and it was so sudden that no one could really explain why it happened. All that was known was that the owner decided to close it out of the blue. It was incredible to think that a place that seemed to be doing so well would just throw in the towel like that, and even worse, that we were left without the only shopping center in the town was like a step backwards for our small community. But anyway, once the shopping center closed, 1,001 theories began to emerge throughout the community. It was a close-knit town and news spread fast, you know, small town, big hell. But the hardest part wasn't just losing that place where we could go shopping. but also the fact that many people were left without work. My dad was in the military, a Marine, so he wasn't home much. While my mom was a teacher at my high school, so we weren't affected as much, but for many, like the family of my best friend Helen, it was a hard blow, as her mom worked in a clothing store in the mall, and her dad was a mechanic, so the situation was complicated for them. However, at that age, children tend to have different concerns. At that moment, we were only thinking about the prom. Helen had seen a dress in the shop where her mother worked, and she already had her eye on it. But with the mall closed, that dress seemed unattainable. I also wanted to find the perfect dress, and I didn't want to shop in the boutiques that were full of girls from other cities. So one day, like any other teenager with crazy plans, Helen and I decided that we had to get those dresses at all costs. At this point, many of you are probably thinking that we were crazy, and yes, as an adult, I now understand it. But at that moment, there was nothing more important than going to the dance. We decided to make it a mission and enter the closed mall. Deep down, I knew it was a bad idea, but the adrenaline and excitement drove us on. Our school was only a few blocks away from the mall, so the idea was to walk there. But the problem was how to get in, as the front door was closed. However, we decided to try our luck by trying to enter through the back door, which was only for employees. When we arrived, we saw that it was locked, so Helen decided to take out a bottle of chemical she had brought with her, and before I could ask, she poured a few drops on the lock and hit it with a small hammer she had. Helen had stolen that chemical from her dad's garage, claiming that we would use it to break the locks, and of course, the hammer too. This is great, I thought as I watched the magic happen. Finally, we managed to get into the shopping center, but instead of the usual welcome you feel when you enter a place full of lights and shops, we found ourselves in a dark area and in an overwhelming silence. The atmosphere was like an alley full of pipes and cables, and suddenly we were alone in that lonely place. The idea of being alone in such a big place was crazy, so instead of being cautious, we decided to take a walk and skate through the empty corridors. We used the escalators as if they were part of an improvised amusement park, and in doing so, we felt like real bad girls. After having fun for a while, we got hungry and decided to have lunch before continuing with our search for dresses. We knew we had to hurry as we had to get back to school before they closed the door for non-attendance, so we went to the dress shop where Helen's mom worked, and went in the same way we had gone into the shopping center, cautious but excited. As soon as we entered, Helen went straight to look for the dress she had been longing for. I, on the other hand, got lost in the aisles admiring the beautiful designs and colors of all the dresses in the place. I was amazed. There were dresses that made my heart skip a beat. But just when I was about to find Helen to tell her that I had found something incredible, I saw her walking away between two aisles. "Helen!" I shouted, trying to catch up with her only to realize that she had completely disappeared. "Where are you?" I called out to her again. "Helen," I asked, and received a distant reply. "I'm in the back looking for some jewelry for my dress," she said. "I'll meet up with you in a second." But just as I was about to follow her lead, something made me turn towards the main entrance of the shop. I saw something move and I didn't like it one bit. At that moment, alarm bells started ringing in my head and I wasn't sure what to do. The thrill of adventure began to fade and was replaced by an unsettling nervousness that was starting to make my stomach churn. Trying to dispel my doubts, I rushed to the door to see who had entered, but to my surprise, the corridor in front of the shop was completely empty. That was weird. "Helen, did you choose the long or the choker?" I shouted as I turned around, only to find Helen behind me holding two necklaces. "What's wrong? Did I scare you?" she said, laughing. "I'm just choosing a necklace. By the way, choose a choker, it would look great on you," my friend said, making me forget about the door for a moment. I decided to trust her opinion and went into the shop, still somewhat confused by the feeling that I had seen someone leave. But there was no time to think about it, so I started looking at the dresses again and finally opted for an ivory one, while Helen's was black with sequins. We were both very excited about our choices, but when we looked at our phones, we realized that it was already around 5 o'clock in the afternoon,
and the sun was starting to set, so it was time to go back. Without wasting much time, we filled our backpacks with the dresses and jewelry and headed towards the back of the store. But when Helen looked down from the second floor, she turned pale. "Syria, look," she said, pointing. "That guy, have you seen him before?" I turned quickly to look, and sure enough, there was a strange guy walking around. "Who is he? Do you know him?" I asked, suddenly feeling uneasy. "I have no idea," Helen replied, but her voice sounded nervous. We watched the guy move slowly down the corridors, as if he knew exactly where he was going. He was wearing only a t-shirt and pants and had nothing in his hands. He was weird and creepy at the same time. Suddenly, as he was getting on the escalator, the guy turned his head and looked at us. Helen and I were transfixed as we saw that his eyes were red like poisoned apples, and we had the feeling that he was looking directly at us. So without thinking, I grabbed Helen's hand and started running towards the exit, straight back to where we had come in. But when the guy saw us escape, he lunged after us. We could tell he was gaining speed while we could barely move fast because of the heavy backpacks we were carrying, and the exit seemed to be getting further and further away. It was terrifying to think that we weren't going to make it in time, and he was very close now. At one point, we decided that we couldn't run anymore, and we stopped in an area of the corridor, and trembling, we held hands, expecting the worst. But what happened next was something we never saw coming. When the man approached us, to our surprise, instead of attacking us, he jumped over the railing and the void disappeared. We were completely paralyzed, our eyes so wide open they almost popped out of our sockets. "Did he just jump?" Helen asked in a faint voice. "It looks that way," I replied, equally shocked. After a couple of minutes, I plucked up some courage and went over to the railing. "What just happened?" I muttered. Helen moved too, leaning over to look down at the first floor, expecting to see the guy's body down there. But to our surprise, there was nothing. The mall seemed emptier than ever. While we were there, I had a strange feeling that something wasn't right. Something told me that everything that had happened had to do with the closure of the shopping center. That afternoon, we managed to get to school just before the bell rang, and when we got home, Helen asked her mom about the real reason the mall was closed. Then, with a serious face, her mother finally told her the truth. It turns out that there was a boy who worked there, and he had a problem with the manager. When he lost his job, he realized that he would not be able to take care of his little sister, who had a special condition. So he decided to end it all by jumping from the second floor of the shopping center in the middle of the night. The next day, the cleaning staff found his body, and since then, many employees claimed to have seen the boy jumping off the railing. At that moment, everything made sense. So the mall wasn't just closed, it was haunted. I felt guilty for what we had done, but I understood that if that lost soul had made a more drastic decision, our lives would have been much worse. Reflecting on that day, I realized how lucky we were to have made it out alive, even though youthful curiosity had led us to a terrifying place. It reminded me that sometimes it's best to leave things alone and not play with the unknown. We never brought up the subject again and never went back to the mall. I left university with a degree under my arm, but that didn't mean getting a job was easy. Day after day, week after week, I sent my CV to every video game developer and computer company I could find, both in the country and in Europe and Asia. But 6 months later, I was still without a job and the money in my account was running out. I couldn't ignore the fact that I urgently needed a job, no matter what or where, so I set about looking for one. One day, while looking through the ads, I found a job offer at a video game store in the mall. Perfect. For someone like me, who loved video games, it seemed like an ideal place, so I applied, and to my surprise, I quickly got an interview. As soon as I walked in the door, they hired me. My first shift was the next day, and although there were some inconveniences, I managed to get by. After a couple of years of hard work, the boss appointed me assistant manager, and that was how I got my first promotion. My shifts were all in the morning, and I managed to keep the younger employees in line, who often behaved as if they were working in a nursery. But I didn't really mind. As long as they did their job, everything was fine. One day, a new girl came to work. Her name was Lucy, and from the moment I saw her, I knew she was going to be trouble. Not only was Lucy beautiful, but she had a jealous boyfriend who seemed like a real headache. Every time she talked to a guy, he would appear out of nowhere to interrupt and scare her. He was like a dark shadow in the shop, just lurking. The funny thing is that Lucy seemed to enjoy that attention, even though she always managed to act as if she didn't. Things got complicated when some of the guys in the shop started showing her the hidden corridors that connected all the shops in the mall. I don't know if you know this, but some old-school shopping malls have corridors behind the shops where employees can move around without being seen by customers. They were supposed to be for cleaning staff, but I only saw one of them a couple of times, and they were always for hiding and smoking a cigarette. Luckily, at that time, we could still smoke inside the building without any problems. Going back to Lucy, her boyfriend's jealousy and insecurities pushed her into trouble. She started to disappear from everyone's sight for long periods of time and had no idea what she was doing. Her boyfriend was always furious, but she seemed not to care. This routine continued for a while until one day she simply didn't come back to the shop. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was the holiday season, and everyone in the store was stressed out working overtime. However, the weirdness began to happen 4 or 5 days later, when the police showed up with questions about Lucy's disappearance. Disappearance? What's going on here? I thought as I listened to my boss talking to the officers. Of course, I started to get curious about what had really happened to Lucy. I had to find out what was going on, because her disappearance also started to affect us all. People were whispering about possible theories. Some said her boyfriend had something to do with it. Others said she had run away out of fear or had simply left town, but it was all just speculation. As the situation became more complicated, I felt I had to do something. So if there was a chance to find out the truth behind her disappearance and how my work was involved in all this, I was going to look for answers. She was employed in our shop, and it was the last place she was seen before she disappeared, so the whole mess also affected us. After a few days of uncertainty, we found out that Lucy had been reported missing. Her parents had been extremely worried because she hadn't come home, and the police thought that maybe we knew something. But how could we know? I assumed that she had simply had enough of everything and had run away, and while I was trying to make that clear, they seemed quite confused. When they went to look for their boyfriend, they discovered that he had also disappeared, both of them having vanished without a trace. The strangest thing is that, after a week of silence, I almost forgot all about the situation. At least until a strange event happened in January that brought all those memories flooding back. A couple of workers were renovating an empty shop, and after removing everything left behind by the previous tenant, they noticed there was a terrible stench in the place. At first they thought it was old food that had been forgotten, but surprise, surprise, it wasn't that at all. The smell got worse as they searched for the source, and after presuming that a rat had died in the wall, they decided to search an adjoining space that was also empty. They spent an hour going through piles of old screens and leftover materials, which were a real mess, until one of the guys, while moving things around, stumbled upon something that didn't seem to be just trash. When the boy lifted a piece of plywood covering a cupboard, the stench became unbearable. And then, when they removed the board, they came across something chilling. The semi-mummified body of a woman lying on the floor in front of the wall. The intense winter cold had managed to preserve it in an incredible way, so that instead of filling the shopping center with a horrendous stench, it had remained hidden for a long time. The news spread like wildfire, and everyone began to speculate about who the body could be. At least 15 people had passed through that store in the last year, disappearing on their shift or completely disappearing during their lunch breaks. Finally, the answer came like a punch in the stomach. One morning, my manager woke me up with the news that the body found was that of Lucy Spellman, the same girl who had been working with us and who had disappeared just before Christmas. and suddenly all the memories of her boyfriend's jealousy and strange behavior came back to me. That night, when I got back from my shift, everyone was talking about nothing else, and the question on everyone's lips was, who did it? The most obvious person to point the finger at was the jealous boyfriend, who had disappeared soon after. And although there was no sign of him, most people thought he was more involved than we had imagined. A couple of weeks after Lucy's body was found, an article appeared in the newspaper that sparked more gossip. It said that the police had received information about a possible motive behind her disappearance. It turns out that Lucy had been dating a co-worker during her breaks, and they would meet in the same vacant lot where her body was found. Thanks to some customers who saw her with him, they managed to identify the guy, who was 21 and was in the gift shop in the mall. However, the guy told the officers that he was supposed to meet her on the day she disappeared, but he was left waiting in the empty shop and she never arrived. So he thought he couldn't wait any longer, so he went back to his job. Days later, when the police arrived at the shopping center, he heard that Lucy was missing and he had a panic attack. He assumed that he would be blamed for what happened, so he kept quiet about their relationship for that reason. And when he found out that her boyfriend had also disappeared, his concern grew. In the end, everything pointed to the boy being scared. Even though he had information, he decided to stay out of it. I wasn't spared from speculation either. Colleagues said that Lucy and I had a brief affair, but what really happened was that we once shared a couple of getaways to play video games in those hidden areas of the mall, but fortunately, we were never caught. I think it was the only way for us to stay under the radar. I didn't want people to know we were seeing each other. It was obvious that the jealous boyfriend had serious problems, and in the end, the truth came out through a friend of his. It turned out that the boyfriend had indeed been the murderer. The guy was furious because he found out about Lucy's indiscretion with the guy from the shop next door, and he was unable to control his anger, so he took her life on the afternoon she had arranged to meet the other employee. I felt bad for her, but at the same time I understood. It must have been horribly difficult for him to face the idea that Lucy could be with someone else, and that led him to do something terrible. That friend of the boy's confessed that after committing the crime, the boy went to Italy, his native country, and there he adopted a new identity. Luckily, he was arrested a few weeks later and imprisoned. Meanwhile, the years passed, and life went on. I would still see Lucy's photo from time to time in the news. I never forgot her. I couldn't stop wondering about her life and how she had become a victim of a celipate. People thought she was just another girl who got easy and was killed for being unfaithful. But in reality, I think she was just looking for someone who would treat her with respect and affection, without being a possessive madman. She was a good person and didn't deserve the fate she had. I'm going to tell a story that has left a mark on me since I was a child. It was my 12th birthday, and although it wasn't a big party because I didn't have many friends, my dad made sure it was special. There was just me, him, and some neighbors, but the real gift came in the form of a black 9mm pistol. I clearly remember the other parents' faces of surprise, as if they were thinking, what kind of father gives that to his 12-year-old son? But I didn't care in the least. I loved it, and that gift quickly became my treasure. After that party, my dad would take me to our backyard so I could practice shooting, and I was really excited to spend that time with him. It wasn't long before I could hit the target of the old cans I had in the garden. My old man was passionate about guns, and he wanted me to feel the same way. He had an impressive collection, and I learned about each one of them before I turned 18. When we went deer hunting, we used a Thompson center arms rifle. For bird hunting, we took a Remington Model 870. I loved learning everything about those guns. When I arrived at university at the age of 18, I started to collect my own weapons, and my collection grew quickly. I got a Bushmaster AR-15 semi-automatic rifle and an M16 assault rifle. I also found some rare gems like a Lamont revolver and a Racola M1 carbine. The more my collection grew, the more absorbed I became in it, and I soon earned the nickname Gun Nut, as it was all I ever talked about. People thought it was weird, and many tried to convince me to change hobbies, but there was no way that was going to happen. I spent hours at the shooting range, and although I didn't have many friends, that didn't bother me. However, everything changed on February 12, 2007. That morning was normal. I went to class and then to the shooting range to test my new gun. Then I went home and realized I needed more ammunition, so I decided to go to the nearest shopping center. A while after parking the car, just as I was about to go in, I heard a noise that made my blood run cold, the sound of a shotgun. I turned around slowly and saw a guy in a raincoat and a white t-shirt. He was attacking and shooting an old man and his son. I had never witnessed anything like it, and I was paralyzed. While the child managed to escape, the old man was lying on the ground, unable to move, with a bullet in his head and another in his back. Seeing that horrible scene shocked me in a way I couldn't explain. Until that moment, I had seen guns as exciting objects, but that day pushed me into a completely different reality, one I never imagined. For the first time, my thoughts about them faltered, and they no longer seemed like simple tools for fun, but something that could bring great pain and horror. I felt a chill as I realized that the guy he shot was dead. I realized that the attacker was using a 12-gauge shotgun, and I knew that no one would survive a shot like that at close range. At that moment, I saw the attacker start to enter the mall, and adrenaline rushed through me, and although I was terrified, I knew I had to act. I started running inside, shouting for someone to call 911. Someone just killed a man, I told everyone, but I only received confused looks. People thought I was joking or that I was crazy. I wasted no time trying to find a phone in the crowd, but just as I managed to find one and was preparing to dial the emergency number, I heard 2 more shots which echoed in the air. That was when most people realized that something serious was happening, and although some were still looking on skeptically, panic began to filter through the crowd. It was then that I heard 2 loud shots just behind me. Before I could react, an intense pain shot through my arm. I looked down and saw that I was wounded. I had been shot. Confusion took hold of me as people around me started to scream and run, and although I was terrified, I managed to crawl towards a pillar, looking for a place to hide. From there, I poked my head out and saw the attacker, who was entering the mall and looking around. I saw him shoot a security guard who was lucky to escape the shot. The guy then turned and headed down a hallway, and from where I was hiding, I heard more shots echoing in the direction the man had gone. In desperation, I tried to find my phone, but I realized that I had dropped it when I fell to the ground, so now I knew I had no choice. I had to use the 9mm pistol that I always carried with me. It took me a moment to gather my courage, but I knew I had to do something, and I was probably the only one who could. So, ignoring the burning pain in my arm, I followed the sound of the gunshots as a feeling of terror took hold of me. The scenes I encountered as I followed the attacker were terrifying. There was a dreadful trail of bodies lying around. In a corner, I saw the corpse of a woman with wounds to her chest and head. I felt that each sight was a direct blow to the stomach. Hearing another shot and the sound of glass breaking, I ran towards the sound and found a nearby card shop. There, among the broken glass, was an old woman lying face down. She and the scenes around me left me in a state of shock. I couldn't believe what was happening, but I knew I had to move on. The risk was high and chaos was raging all around me. I saw another woman lying on the ground with shots in her arm and stomach. My heart almost stopped when I saw the attacker. From the corner, I watched in horror as he pointed his gun at 3 people in front of the store. Among them was a small child. Luckily, he didn't seem to see me, so very scared, I prepared my pistol, but I don't know why. I just stood there frozen. Although I had been shooting guns all my life, at that moment my hands were shaking so much that I couldn't pull the trigger. So I just watched in silence as the guy pulled the trigger, ending those innocent lives. After a moment, I left the shop. The child's mother was trying to crawl towards her son, who was still moving, but that was all she could do. Then the attacker returned without hesitation and shot them all in the head. It was a brutal blow. The struggle between fear and helplessness overwhelmed me, and suddenly nausea overcame me. I vomited in sheer anguish, cursing myself for not being able to shoot with the courage I had always admired in others. I knew that if I did, I would be as monstrous as he was. I had seen films where people fired guns, but that was just on screen. Nothing compares to seeing it for real. At that moment, an overwhelming revulsion towards the gun in my hand made me drop it. I saw it hit the ground as my mind went blank. I don't want to be here, I thought, and I started to crawl away. Soon after, I saw a policeman. He asked me if I was okay, but before I could answer, I collapsed to the ground. Life was slipping away from me. I had lost a lot of blood, but I was still conscious. Then I heard more shots to my right, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw that the officers had found the assailant, who was still shooting despite being surrounded. Within minutes, the cops were firing back, and in the end, the man fell dead. When it was all over, the paramedics took me to the hospital, where I discovered that fortunately I had only been wounded in the arm. Apart from the loss of blood, I was not in a critical condition. The Trolley Square shooting shook all of Utah and the rest of the United States. More than 6 people died and 4 were injured. The attacker was identified as Suleiman Tolovich. The police investigated his life thoroughly in search of answers, but found nothing. His family seemed as baffled as the rest of the world, as everyone knew him as a good guy. The truth is that I lost interest in following the case. I just wanted to heal and put the trauma behind me. You know, I sold all the guns in my collection, because what used to excite me a lot now only caused me fear and rejection. I tried to convince my dad to give up his obsession with guns, but he refused, which created a great distance between us. More than 15 years have passed since the incident, and looking back, all it took me was a couple of minutes to see the horror that the guns I loved so much could cause in the wrong hands.